or Elizabethan theater beyond the bar. I am Lady Katherine Coscombe. I am from the Shire of Rivendell, which is mundanely Youngstown, Ohio. Throw a rock, you're an Ethelbark. In real life, I am actually a theater professor at Youngstown State University, although I am a costume designer, not a historian. But since doing the SCA, I have really kind of embraced the importance and impact of theater culturally. And I really like exploring the stuff that's a little less popular. And so the reason I developed this class is because everybody knows Shakespeare. Everybody has probably, at some point in high school, read through at least one. Or at the very least, they've seen The Lion King. Or West Side Story. And so Shakespeare tends to loom really large in contemporary culture, and he tends to really dominate the conversation. But he's not the only person that is making Elizabethan theater what it was, and he is not the only person that's creating and really defining the form. Shakespeare is coming into a theatrical culture where a lot of the stuff is actually kind of established. And so I really wanted to talk about what this theater looks like and who else we really should be paying attention to and celebrating. And so before I get into true Elizabethan theater, I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in England before that.
What wasn't happening in England before that?
Many things were happening in England before that. England is largely typical in terms of its medieval style theater. So the predominant form of theater in England at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century is what we call lay vernacular religious theater. So it is Catholic theater on religious themes performed in the local language, vernacular, by non-clergy, so lay vernacular religious theater. I've got a whole class on that too. In England, these largely manifested as cycle plays. And cycle plays would be a big, huge community festival where they do a whole series of plays. And in England, plays were presented mobile, on pageant wagons. So they've got basically parade floats that they're going around doing these little plays, basically on Bible stories. One of the cool things about these cycle plays is they're very, very widespread. So all of the major towns have their own cycle. So they're very popular, they're very widespread, they're being done by regular people, they're a kick, they're a lot of fun. They are very Catholic. They're often also very anachronistic, so Noah will talk about the Pope, and Moses will bid his beads, so time is a little fuzzy with regards to those. The players are amateurs, and in England, they are guild-sponsored. So, for example, the Vinters might be doing the wedding at Cana. The fishermen might be doing Jonah. There tends to be really strong associations between the nature of the guild's work and the subject matter of their play. And there's a lot of, pride tied up into doing these plays really, really well. So again, they're insanely popular. The plays themselves are anonymous. You've got, each city has their little stack of cycle plays, but we don't know the names of the playwrights. Scholars sometimes identify through textual clues. Oh, these are all written by the same person. You've got the York realist who also uses a lot of alliteration. The Wakefield master, who just is funny as all get out. But because these are compendiums, you'll also find duplicate plays. So, for example, no one ever does the first Shepherd's play. So you've got this pretty vibrant theatrical culture. And a thing you'll find often with theater is theater, because of its nature, because it is collaborative, takes a lot of people, and has to please an audience, theater tends to be one of the arts that stylistically changes the slowest. And so as we're entering the 16th century, when we're really hardcore Renaissance everywhere else, theater is still largely medieval. And we're going to see Renaissance-style theater in England up until the English Civil War. So again, you've got that lag. So what happens? Why does this incredibly popular, incredibly funny, incredibly widespread, and incredibly, just great form of theater basically disappear? Anyone want to take a guess? Because it's Catholic. Because it's Catholic. And Henry, bless his heart, cannot keep it in his pants. So in 1534, Henry gets horny, and we kick off the English Protestant Reformation. And it gets real messy. The English Reformation, in particular, is very violent. There's lots of heads rolling around. Mary comes back, we're Catholic again. Then you got Elizabeth, and we are back to being Protestant. Catholicism and Judaism both get banned. So you've got all of these very Catholic plays. They are not going to stand. There were some efforts made to Protestantize the cycles. So with the surviving cycles, you do see evidence of them being edited to try to make them less Catholic. A lot of them were simply, quite frankly, destroyed. As a matter of fact, we only have a tiny handful. We have the York cycle, the Townley/Wakefield cycle, and the Endtown cycle. That's it. That's what we got. So most of them were just, frankly, destroyed. So I don't have the dates on this, but you're also seeing these conflicts between Catholicism and Protestantism in Europe. And because you've got all of this tradition of lay people using religious plays to do stuff, you get things like Jesus going on stage and being like, all you papists are heretics and going to hell. And then you've got another Jesus being like, oh, no. All of you Protestants, are heretics and you're all going to hell. So it gets really nasty, and it gets really nasty on stage. Basically, the one thing the Protestants and the Catholics agree on is to ban religious theater. So both the Catholic Church and the government are like, nope, we're just not doing it. So all of a sudden, this big, huge popular thing gets killed. So, but people are people. People make theater. People make theater at every time and every culture. So it is not going to go away entirely. But we've got to do something different. And that's where we're going to see England really come up with a unique style. Because Italy is doing its own thing. It's ruining European theater for 400 years, and I will fight you.
Oh! Yikers!
Arrows fired.
Bring it on. Comedians.
International.
So yes, we get this big ban on theater. But we have a place where it's going to kind of survive, and from where it survives is where it's going to grow again. And the place it's going to survive is in the schools. And there's actually a really long tradition that predates even Quem Caritas back in the 11th century and the resurgence of theater in general. To be educated was to speak Latin, right?
Yeah.
And to speak Latin, you've got to learn dialogue. And you know what's really good for learning dialogue? Plays. And so you've got a centuries-long tradition of using the plays of Plautus and Terence, two Roman comic playwrights, to teach Latin. And so these are still being taught in the schools. And so it's from this classical education that we start to see plays being written that are secular, but are being modeled on classical structure and styles. So that's where we're going to see the English form really develop. We also have not just the classical influences, but also medieval literature and histories are all being brought in because they're doing this in the school. So why not? These are originally not presented publicly. They are being written for the schools to be performed by the students for the students. Originally, the writers were either the teachers or the students themselves. So these are all amateur writers. But they do become popular. We see the establishment of boys' acting companies. Elizabeth I actually set up a boys' acting company as court entertainment at Blackfriars in 1576. And yeah, the earliest companies are all children's companies, all boys' companies. Adult professional companies are going to happen later. One of the earliest new English plays that we have is a play called Ralph Royster Doyster, which dates somewhere to the late 1530s. We don't have an exact date for it. It was written by a fellow named Nicholas Udall, who was a headmaster at Eton. He graduated from Oxford. Was thrown out later for buggery. His criminal sentence was commuted. So, and Royster Doyster is considered really the first comedy in the English language. And we see all of these things are going to become hallmarks of English comedy. First off, we're pulling extensively from Roman comedic styles. Structurally, we've got that 5-act structure, use of eavesdropping, of disguise, of kind of focusing on relationships and misunderstandings and running around like crazy people. But these are directly English. They are making fun of English social roles. So they're taking that Roman structure and just being like, yeah, well, we're English and we're going to embrace it. One of the other things you see is the use of flighting. And flighting is a Norse and Scottish tradition, and you'll see it later in England. Basically, you get to insult each other in a really witty way. So we've got Elizabethan rap battles written into these scripts. And again, this becomes a hallmark of that witty repartee becomes a hallmark of Elizabethan comedy. And again, the focus on middle-class characters rather than, you know, nobility or anybody fancy. The second English comedy is a play called Gammer Gurton's Needle. And with this, we also see the introduction and extensive use of the fool, which is also going to become a hallmark of English comedy. And it is bawdy. There are so many euphemisms and innuendos all through it. It is very blue and very naughty. It was written sometime around 1553. We have a known performance at 1567 at Christ's College at Cambridge. We don't know the author. The author was attributed to a J.S. And there's speculation on whether it was a fellow named John Still, a William Stevenson, or a John Bridges. All three of these men later became clergymen and did not wish to be associated with the naughty play. You can imagine all of the things a needle which pokes people in the bum gets associated with.
Oh.
So yeah, so we've got these university comedies, and they start getting more elaborate, they start getting more popular, they start becoming court entertainments. All of a sudden, these cute little school plays are a thing. And so the scripts have to get better. The shows have to get better, because you don't have your cycle plays, right? You've got a gap. And also, all of those boys grow up, go to college, and have been writing plays. So all of a sudden we see the birth of a professional playwright. And so instead of just writing all the scripts in-house, you start hiring playwrights to write these plays for the boys' companies. And the earliest of these playwrights, these professional playwrights, are a group we call the University Wits. Kit Marlowe, Thomas Kidd, John Lilly, and Robert Greene are the University Wits. Not all of them actually went to university because historians, man. So they would sell plays to these boys' companies. But then as adult companies became established, they would also sell scripts. So you see a transition from just writing for boys to writing for these adult professional companies. They are writing full-length dramas. These aren't just cute little sketches. The earliest of these was written by, the earliest of these tragedies coming out of this group is a play called Gorboduc, otherwise known as Ferrex and Porrex. All of these Roman influences, right? Written by Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville. And Gorboduc is also the first English tragedy. So now we've got comedy and tragedy. We've got two major genres. It does, looking at this stuff does get a little bit messy. And one of the really tricky things about looking at early modern England and looking at this period of drama is it's just often controversial. Sources are a little thin on the ground. So there's very few primary sources. I mean, we don't even know what the theaters actually looked like. We have a handful of sketches done by non-theater people. We have no extant theaters. The Puritans dismantled them all stick by stick. I mean, so they're just gone. There's very little archaeological evidence. A lot of the plays don't actually get written down or printed until well after the fact. So the accuracy of our surviving scripts can be messy. And they might be two different versions cobbled together. Records of people are terribly kept. So when someone was born, when someone was died, you know, sometimes, is that one person or two people? Good. I'm not sure. Oh, heaven forbid if you have Thomas, father of Thomas. There's only 5 names in Elizabethan England.
Right.
You know, and spelling is also non-standardized. So again, sometimes this is just really messy territory to research. So as we look at Gorboduc and we look at these early tragedies, again, we see more hallmarks of the Elizabethan form. First off, you've got that Roman influence. We talked about Plautus and Terence and comedy, but when it comes to tragedy, that we owe a lot to Seneca. And Seneca, some of the key points. One, are characters obsessed with revenge. Revenge is a really common theme in pretty much all of the Elizabethan tragedies. It's somebody has done wrong, revenge must be had. Usually there's a lot of murder, which ties into on-stage violence. Lots of it. You will stab, you will behead, you will cut out tongues. There will be all of the violence. We are not afraid of it. And the inclusion of the supernatural. You will see gods, ghosts, demons, all of that everywhere. So all of that is kind of coming from this Senecan influence. Roman and English history are common sources for plots. They also steal a lot of plot lines from Italian Renaissance literature. So that is also a major source. The big thing that defines English theater, apart from continental theater, is an explicit rejection of neoclassicism. So the Italians got their hands on some, Aristotle and Horace, read about what they said and said, oh, these are the rules and this is what theater must look like. And England said, nah. And so with this, these plays have basically an episodic plot structure. You might have this happens, this happens, this happens. You've got sprawling stories that take place over a long span of time versus a really tight climatic act structure where you've got one plot line, you do your inciting incident, you build up, you've got a climatic moment, you've got your tie. It's all very neat and triangle shaped. now it's much more sprawling. You've got different high points and low points. You're kind of going on a journey in this 5-act play. Multiple locations, which again hits unity of place. Some of these plays take place over years, so forget unity of time. And usually there is a main plot and about 5 subplots, so forget unity of plot. There are no unities in English theater. Also, the neoclassicists rejected explicit depictions of violence or of the supernatural because violence was not decorous and we wanted decorum, and, well, supernatural things just aren't real, so we shouldn't have those on stage. Also, the use of soliloquy. Again, does not work for neoclassicism because who are they talking to? But soliloquy is where a character will be alone on stage, voicing their thoughts to no one, as well as the use of the aside, where the actor will directly address the audience. Asides in particular come directly from medieval-style theater, where in those cycle plays, they will jest back and forth with their audience. Also, even though we talk about, oh, we've got comedies and tragedies, there's not purity in these genres. You will find sad things happen in comedies. You will find happy moments and comic relief in the tragedy. So you get peanut butter in the chocolate, and it's okay. So that's kind of the form at large. So looking at major playwrights, the first one I want to talk about is Thomas Kyd. Thomas Kyd is, of course, one of our university wits. His father was a scrivener, so a reader and writer of legal documents. So clearly Thomas Kyd was destined to be literate. Ironically, for being the first of the university wits we talk about, Thomas Kyd probably didn't go to university. He was probably just trained by his father as a scrivener. His playwriting emerges in the 1580s, and he was known to be roommates with Christopher Marlowe. Well, I'm entirely certain they shared a room. How many beds were in that room? I cannot speculate. One of his most famous play is probably The Spanish Tragedy. I love the cover from its first edition where Geronimo is mad again, and Geronimo is just like stomping off with his little speech bubble. And with The Spanish Tragedy, again, we've got an episodic structure, 5 acts. We have ghosts, we have soliloquies, we've got revenge, we've got 57 frickin' locations. So it is all of the things you expect to see. So if you're going to read one English tragedy that's not Shakespeare, I recommend Kyd. Spanish Tragedy is just like a perfect example of the form. It's not as good as Faust, but Faust is messy. Some of his other works, he has a lost Hamlet. So we know he did a Hamlet, and we know he did a Hamlet before Billy did a Hamlet, but that Hamlet is lost. We have a lot of lost plays. Basically, there's no copyright protection. So they're very protective of the texts because that's the way you protect your investment. Other people can't get their hands on it. You would have pirates that would go into the theater and just try to memorize the script and write it down. But most plays don't get printed until well after the fact. Everything that had to get printed had to be registered with the stationers. So we've got a lot of titles. We have more titles of things that were printed than things that survive. So Hamlet is one of those lost plays. The Folger Library actually has a really fantastic index of lost plays and what we know about them, which can be really varied. One of his other ones that is, again, lost is a King Lear. So we've got a lost Lear and a lost Hamlet. So now we're going to talk about my favorite Elizabethan playwright, my boy. You can see him looking really, really sexy. It's Chris Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe died young. He was only 29 when he died. Was the son of a shoemaker. but was so freaking brilliant that he attended Cambridge on scholarship. Stories about Kit Marlowe get wild. So it was reputed that he was a spy for England, that he was a spy against England, that he was an atheist, that he was a Catholic, that he was a magician, that he was a homosexual. Only Thomas Kidd knows for sure. So he, well, even his death is controversial about just exactly how he died. He died in a tavern brawl, potentially over the favor of a widow of questionable reputation. But possibly because he was a spy. Or possibly because he was a secret Catholic working for the Pope. He was stabbed and he died. He died young. Marlowe is really who we credit for establishing and popularizing the mighty line. That's Marlowe's, and I want to give him full credit for that one. And the mighty line is iambic pentameter. An iamb is basically a 2-beat set of syllables with a stressed and an unstressed syllable. Da-dun, da-dun, da-dun. And it's the sound of your heartbeat. And the joy of iambic pentameter is because it ties into the natural rhythm of the body. When you're speaking in iambic pentameter, the body resonates with it, and it sounds poetic. Pentameter means there's just 5 iambs in a line. Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships? And so that provides this kind of structure to this blank verse that, really makes these plays feel so elevated because of that mighty line. One of the things he does is take the idea of a morality play, which is another medieval form. Morality plays are basically not specific biblical stories or stories of saints' lives, but morality plays are how to be a good person. And he took the idea of a morality play and adapted it into a full-length tragedy. The tragedy being, don't make deals with demons, you idiot! So Faustus is absolutely his most famous and quite frankly his most masterful play. And it is a huge, glorious thing. Takes place over, I forget how many decades, so it is a beast. It wasn't his first and biggest hit. Tamerlane, in 2 parts. The Jew of Malta is one of his other big ones. The Jew of Malta is a really rough read from a modern perspective. It is horrifically anti-Semitic. Edward II, so we've got a history. So we've got a mixture of things. But again, he was killed tragically young, which kind of cut off his writing.
That'll happen.
That'll
As
happen.
it tends to do, yes.
So
No truth to the rumor it was Shakespeare that stabbed them.
yeah. No well, one of the things I think I mentioned, Sackville and Norville. It's actually really common for playwrights to collaborate. Nowadays we're really used to playwrights kind of just going off and doing everything on their own, but we have a lot of collaborations or plays which don't necessarily have ascribed authorship, but you can tell there are 2 different writing styles. So, it's a community. They look at each other's work. They give each other feedback. You are getting back and forth between playwrights. So there is a lot of collaboration, and you'll see, team-ups that happen repeatedly. Kidd will work with anybody. Dryden, who's a little bit later, again, collaborates all of this. Dryden almost never writes by himself. So you'll see this kind of widespread. The last playwright I want to talk about is John Lilly. And it's nice to get because these have been primarily tragic playwrights. Lilly is primarily interested in comedies and in lighter plays. Lilly was Oxford educated and really liked to kind of live flashy and high on style and high in society, Lily really wanted to be a mover and shaker. And so his style is very witty, very florid, very elaborate. His language is just very over the top. He calls his style, I am going to screw this up, euphuism? It's not euphemism because I can say that word. You know, but it's all about these little parallel phrases and sentences. It's lots of alliteration, very kind of contrived similes. I'm not actually a huge fan of Lily's work. I'm sorry. We have 8 surviving plays. At least 6 of these were performed privately for the Queen. He works mostly in classical and pastoral settings. So we're out in, you're out in fields and shepherds and, dryads and all kinds of that stuff. He tried for years to become the Master of Revels. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Master of Revels. But he never got it. He tried like crazy. To quote, 13 years, your highness servant, but yet nothing. 1,000 hopes, but all nothing. 100 promises, but yet nothing. Drama queen. All right, so if this is how he talks, imagine how he writes a play. He was a private secretary to Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who did not write Shakespeare's plays. De Vere sponsored Lily's lease at Blackfriars, and De Vere also produced Lily's first 2 plays, Campaspe and Sappho and Phao. A lot of his stuff was performed by the Oxford boys. Despite the fact that he was all about self-style and kind of flitting around with the upper crust, he lost favor and he died in poverty. So Lily does not have a particularly good end. When we talk about the theaters, I mentioned Blackfriars and I've mentioned boys' companies. We've got 2 main types of theater. We've got the public theaters and the private theaters. The public theaters are for the adult companies. Public theaters are outdoors. They're huge. They sit between 1,500 and 3,000 people. They're relatively cheap to get into. There's tiers of admission. So you can basically pay a penny to get in, then you're just sort of, hey, in a pit. I'm in a pit. I feel like a groundling. I need to prop my elbows up on something. You pay a little bit more, you can sit on a bench. Pay a little bit more than that. You can even get a cushion. So fancy. They're not actually particularly reputable. I'm not saying that, the nobility wouldn't go to a public theater, but it's kind of like doing something a little naughty to go to a public theater. They're not in the good part of town. They are all on the wrong side of the river. So I have a little map of where I've got one going this way, I'm going to start one going this way, of where they're all located. You're like, oh yeah, no, that is the wrong side of the Thames. So they're not properly in London. They're just near London. The first theater, by the way, was in fact called the Theater. Thank you, England. So yeah, they're right next to bear baiting and cockfighting, and it is not necessarily the best place to be. The Theater, the Curtain, the Rose, the Swan, the Hope, the Red Bull, and the Globe are so there's a lot of theaters. But notice that while they're not in London, they're all right around London. Do you know where we're not seeing theater? York, Coventry, Wakefield. So theatrical activity is really concentrated to London. So we've lost that widespread theater. It's really interesting and fascinating in London, but it ain't anywhere other than London.
Thank you.
And then you have the private theaters. And I talk about how vanishingly little we know about the public theaters, because Puritans tore them apart. Like we've got speculative drawings based on what we know about what they look like. We know even less about what the indoor theaters look like. I included one sketch. The sketch that's in the handout was done by a Dutch tourist after his visit. And we also have a little watercolor that shows a theater from the outside, but the proportions are all crazy. But yeah, we know very little about those. The private theaters were smaller. I mean, they're still decent. We're looking usually around 600 seats. But they're indoors. They were used exclusively for boys' companies until 1608. They are much more expensive and much more exclusive. And it's not that lower class people were banned or something from going to an indoor theater, but they're just expensive because it's a smaller space and the tickets cost more, and so fewer people are going to spend the money to go to this indoor theater. These are found both inside and outside of the City of London. You've got Blackfriars and Whitefriars. There's a first and a second Blackfriars. So with these, these look in fact a lot like a bear baiting ring. You've got kind of a little pit of a stage and benches. And it's coming this way. I don't know, we're just sending stuff all over the place. And you've got the pit is facing the stage in one direction versus sort of that thrust setup that you see in the public theaters with backless benches. Then you've got galleries and boxes on three sides. Later in period, during the Jacobean and Carolingian periods, Caroline periods. Why is Charles Caroline? But anyway, really wealthy audience members would actually sit on the stage itself.
Oh my.
So everybody could see them being there. So everybody knew how fancy they were. Some of the drawings we have look like, again, converted cockpits or bear baiting. But they may have been, instead of being a converted cockpit, they may have just been built originally as theaters. We don't know. When it comes to the adult professional companies, the way that these companies worked in England is a structure called a sharing company. And so you have a group of around 25 members, and pretty much all of them are also going to be actors, but you might have playwrights who are also actors, so you've got, people that are within the company making the things. But you've got basically 3 tiers of membership in the company. You have your shareholders, you've got your hirelings, and you have your apprentices. Shareholders are the ones who drive the company. They have paid into ownership of this acting company and therefore take a part of the profits because they are kind of full owning members. And then you might have hirelings, actors or other people who will be brought in, paid a fee for a specific performance or a specific show. So they're kind of freelancing. And then you have apprentices who are paying to be there and learning the craft, who eventually hope to become a shareholder. Now, with these acting companies, actors cannot be trusted. And so there's a lot of controls over who does theater and what levels of supervision they get while doing it. So, for example, in 1559, Elizabeth banned all unlicensed plays outside of schools, right? So to do a play, you need a license. To get a license, you need somebody who issues, oh God, I can't talk today, who issues a license, and that person's going to be the master of revels. Their job is basically to oversee all of the theater that's happening to make sure it's not breaking any laws or doing religious subjects or hitting anything controversial. And to have a company that can get licenses, you also need a noble sponsor. You need a chaperone to make sure you don't get into trouble. This is how Rivendell gets in trouble. We have no nobility.
Yeah. Oh, I'm
So
working on it.
we're going wild. The minimum level for a noble would be a baron. The two most famous companies are, of course, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which is Burbage, Kemp, Shakespeare, which eventually became the King's Men underneath James I, but that's post-period. And you have the Lord Admiral's Men, who were the chief rivals of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and that's where we see Edward Allen and Philip Henslow. Marlowe worked primarily with the Lord Admiral's Men. They performed mostly at the Rose and the Fortune. Philip Henslow, by the way, and you can find this online, Philip Henslow has a diary where he talks about saw a new play, commissioned a new play, lent my play out. It is a glorious gold mine of stuff that's going on. And again, the whole thing's been digitized. Speaking of Kemp, the little woodcut there is Kemp dancing across London with his little Morris bells on his legs. He'd like to do a lot of stunts. He was he was a lot. Within a company would pay by the play. So they would buy a script from a playwright. And it was their play. They bought it. That's why they were so protective of that physical script, because there's no copyright. Now, sometimes you have shareholders, so a member of the company writes the play, and they're getting part of the profit because they're part owners. So sometimes the way playwrights got paid is typically the second performance of a play. All of the profits from the second performance would go to the playwright. The first performance did not. And if your play was a bomb, you didn't get paid. It had to be good enough to get a second performance. New plays would be performed about once a week for several weeks, and then, if popular, they'd pop back up in the season. Companies might produce as many as 16 new plays in a season, in addition to revivals.
That's a heavy load.
That is, well, consider too that the actors have their roles. So just imagine that you've got to hold Tamburlaine, Faust, and Edward in your head and have to perform them with very little notice.
Yeesh.
Actors are all male. This is the English tradition. When we're looking at medieval plays, they were performed primarily by men. There's disputed scholarship of whether or not there were women on the English stage with those cycle plays, but primarily men. And explicitly in the 16th century, all of the actors are men. So it would be typical for the apprentices and the boys to play the kind of ingenues and pretty young ladies, but nurses and queens and maids and the funnier women tend to be older men. So there's a bit of a mix there.
In the Monty Python tradition.
Listen, the Panto Dame goes back a really long way.
I know.
Respect the Panto Dame. So I'm gonna skip Johnson and Webster because they really are post-period. They're fantastic, but they're a little late. I want to talk about the Mask. The Mask is one of the other forms of theater that we're going to see. And the Mask is a kind of court entertainment. The biggest significance of the Mask really is it brings Italianate scenic design, because you've got all of these locations and multiple times in Elizabethan theater. So you're going from place to place to place very, very quickly. So you functionally do not have a set. The theater has some structure to it, so it's got a second level. The second level's a balcony, rock on. But instead, you know, you have spoken decor. Behold, the Forest of Arden. There's no forest. The Victorians tried to do that stuff and drove themselves mad. But there's not really scenery. It's with the mask that we see elaborate scenery being brought to England. Very specifically, this very complex, perspective-using, full-of-the-eye, moving parts scenery. Because the mask is a form of theater which is all about spectacle. They're huge, elaborate entertainments. They're presented at court. They especially flourished under the last two kings before the Civil War with James and Charles. But it is all about this particular noble that we're celebrating. There's a lot of music, there's a lot of dance, all kinds of elaborate backdrops. Members of the court were often brought in to also perform in elaborate costumes. Not necessarily good performances, but elaborate costumes. If you look good enough, you know, it's fine. Mythology and allegorical figures are big. So gods, goddesses, nymphs, you might be the zodiac. But in the end, the monarch is going to be the big hero. Because this is all about the monarch. They're crazy expensive to produce, but we don't care. We're wearing the crown. We can do it. Johnson, who I basically skipped, was one of the major playwrights of the mask form, but he basically had a little huff and stopped writing them because he thought the spectacle was overriding his literary contribution and was not there for it. Johnson also is going to develop the comedy of humors, which is a style of comedy which is based on personality traits. You guys are familiar with the idea of the humors. You've got 4 fluids in the body, and if your personality is dominated by a it's SpongeBob SquarePants, guys. SpongeBob is sanguine. Squidward is melancholic. Patrick is the slow, laid-back one of the Biles. Phlegmatic? Phlegmatic. And the angry crab. Anyway, it's SpongeBob SquarePants. So it's all about these personality types clashing. Of course, the first comedy of humors is called Every Man in His Humor, because of course. And when it comes to designing these, you don't have a lot of scenic design. You also don't have a lot of costume design with most of these plays. The actors are wearing their own clothes, and they're wearing contemporary clothes. They might make a token attempt at looking like something else. But with the mask, we really start to see the designer, and the designer as an artist, which speaks to me because I'm a designer. And so we've got Inigo Jones, and we've got a picture of one of Inigo Jones' surviving designs from a mask on the back. So he's a court architect and designer. He's the one that brings in that Italian scenery, and does all of this gorgeous stuff. He's doing machinery, revolving platforms, trapdoors, these glorious, fanciful costumes. Things are great. Things are gonna be great up until about the 1630s. The Puritans hate fun, and the Puritans really hate Charles I. So yeah, Chucky's gonna lose his head. The Puritans are going to take over. Cromwell, you got a Commonwealth, all of this stuff. The Puritans are going to ban theater. Dryden has a private theater in his country estate where he does secret plays. It's great. But there's really, a big ban on theater. Chucky Part 2 is hiding in France, picking up neoclassicism so he can ruin English theater when he brings it back. So yeah, and that's, so again, just like we had a really abrupt end to that medieval style theater because of war and conflict, Again, we see a kibosh on the Elizabethan style, again because of war and conflict. It's not going to come back until Charles II restores the English throne during the English Restoration, and we call that style of theater, surprise, surprise, Restoration theater. So we have sprinted through a century and still have time. So now, questions? Yes.
Actually, two, or one question and one comment. When did women start acting?
You're going to see them in the Restoration.
Okay.
It's a whole Restoration theater, and you also start to see women playwrights in Restoration theater. Women acting their way up to being the king's mistress. It's a wild period. It's really fun. It's a shame it's so late for us, but it's a lot of fun.
And the other thing was, I wanted to comment, you talked about flitting earlier. It goes back to Anglo-Saxon
It
times.
absolutely
Because
does.
it's in Beowulf, and he talks to Unferth. It's a flitting contest.
Yeah, as I said, it starts with the Norse, but it becomes this whole big tradition, and we see this a lot, particularly in the English comedies. And it's not something you see in the continental stuff to the same extent. It's very much English. So.
This is what happens when Protestantism goes forward, but there was also some Protestant, some non-neoclassicism in the Protestant areas is around there. Although because there would be World War and there were the vicinity, there was not much time for theaters. That which is the reason why the 30 years war went down the way it did.
Yeah, theater, it's tough. There's a lot of conditions you need in place to really have a vibrant theatrical scene. And again, the Elizabethan theater is really a golden age. There's a ton of output. I didn't even talk about domestic tragedies, unless y'all want to come back for Broadside Baddies, where I will talk about domestic tragedies and true crime. So...
Up on the third floor.
So, to back up to...
This is 302.
Is it 302? Really?
I have 102.
They changed it.
Okay.
Oh,
Better start walking, yeah.
It's not till 3. There is an hour between this class and the next
I
class.
got today.
So,
Oh, I just downloaded this like a week ago. That's okay.
they moved me
So you
because,
don't have to move.
yeah, because I was like, I don't want to be back to back on different floors.
Yeah.
So I am not back to back on different floors. Any other questions?
Just an observation. Elizabeth was quite right that actors can't be trusted.
Well,
Because, to jump clear to the 21st century there for a second, when I was a junior in high school, my first role was Judge Turpin in Sweeney Todd.
Ooh.
The school board had kittens when we put on the performance. It was hilarious.
You cannot trust that.
No, because, and ever since then, they made the choir director run the spring musical past them first.
I'm a designer and a technician. I know well how actors cannot be trusted.
The year after we did Fiddler on the Roof, because it was
In the 90s, my high school did a chorus line in rural southwestern Pennsylvania.
Oh no!
Wow.
We did 7 Brides for 7 Brothers the next year. Kidnapping a bunch of women, way less controversial.
It's either that or Heidi. So
I am from southwestern Indiana, in the area where all the German Catholics settled. What got everyone's dander up was not all the murder; it was the song "Have a Little Priest."
It's
it's the best song. It's the biggest laugh in the show.
It is.
There are so many
But
terrible puns.
specifically,
try the priest.
The whole concept of fiction is lost on some people. I swear.
Wait a second, I need